Welcome to Module 2 of the CDOT Utilities Process Management course. In this module, we will review the planning phase, which includes programming, project scoping, and budgeting. We will also see that a number of and types of utilities involved and how each project can greatly be affected by how long the utility coordination may take, and that the impact to the design and construction phases when it comes to budgeting, scoping, and programming. So again, going back to our utility engineering program chart of phasing here, or flow. So we're beginning in the planning phase. You'll also see DSR is an acronym, which we have a lot of, design, scoping, review. So during this planning phase, again, the programming, budgeting, and project scope, we'll be looking at criteria under the Subsurface Utility Engineering Law 9-1.5-102.67 is the Subsurface Utility Engineering Notification. So that will be reviewed here shortly as to applicability to a project. Again, how to program it, budget it, and schedule for it in this planning phase. So during the programming process at this stage, the planning steps involved include: one, project development plan. This is a very important piece of developing the critical path items and identifying each stakeholder within a project at the engineering programming level. And for utilities, in particular, making sure utility engineering program is included in this PDP process, or PD process, sorry, project development plan, integrating utility risk and cost into this PDP, accounting for cost and schedule of subsurface utility engineering, and that SUE occurs between 0 and 10% design. And again, we'll explain why that's critical. Utility engineering program manager endorsement and signature on the milestone. And Joe, have you developed these or signed off on these?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So step 2 in the programming planning steps is the project a SUE required project. And we touched on this a little bit in the introduction of SUE as far as the 4 criteria that determine if a subsurface utility engineering project is required. And again, we'll review those here in a little bit more detail. So again, the project involves a construction contract with a public entity, which we have a lot of those at CDOT, with contractors, construction. And so the construction project involves horizontal construction, which we have a lot of here at CDOT, exceeds 2 feet in depth, and it is a contiguous 1,000 square feet on the surface, or involves any utility boring. So you might have a project that doesn't require open excavation, but does have subsurface excavation like a utility bore, and so that will add as the criteria for number 3 there, in lieu of the surface disturbance and excavation requirements of 2 feet in depth or more. So just keep that in mind as you look at the criteria related to your project in the future. And then is the project overall designed by and stamped by a professional engineer. So it's critical that all 4 of these criteria are reviewed, and you have to put a check by each and every one of them. And if you do, then a SUE required project by state statute is then initiated and required. And finally, step 3, project development plan, risk assessment or risk management is part of this programming and planning steps, and how does utility coordination and SUE fit into the project development plan? Well, you got to consider the project scope. Is it a major scope? Is it a minor scope? Major scope is a Central 70 project where you're taking I-70 from an elevated position and cutting a big hole through the ground and all utilities for several miles, to a minor scope, which could include a chip seal project in Joe's region up, State Highway 64 out in the middle of nowhere type of thing. So that could be a minor scope of work. So consider the project risk, low, medium, or high. Again, that's that resurfacing low signal project, maybe medium to high, just depends on what's going on with that signal. And then reconstruction, or of course a railroad component within your project, definitely makes it a little more risky or high risk. Joe, do you agree with all that?
Yeah, I think that's a good overview of the kind of initial planning considerations within the PDP, and looking at risk of the project, understanding the project expense, understanding kind of the overall complexity in the project and what risk we're going to have to assume. It's very, very early on in the project, but you have a pretty good idea of urban versus rural, high utility density or low, very low utility dense corridors. So I think you did a good job.
And again, thanks, Joe. And again, at this stage, this is a utility coordination effort. Again, whether it's Joe and his staff in the region or other region staff conducting this assessment under the utility coordination effort, or bringing somebody on to help with that from the consultant side. But again, this is the utility coordination segment of the process.
And you really, step 2 is all the steps are important, but if you determine it right out of the gate that it's a SUE required project, it certainly sets in motion the things that Rob spoke about. Do you have to hire consultants? Do you have to have a SUE investigation done? Do you have to go through utility coordination process? And if you miss that step and try to pick it back up in the middle of your project at post FIR, you've really kind of set yourself back. And it can impact design, it can impact project budget, it can impact design schedule, it can impact phasing. So doing that assessment now is critical to the success of the project.
Yeah, and that leads me back to this project development plan, which is initiated by the program engineering group or the resident engineer and the project manager to help communicate back and forth between your team or utility coordination team, those things that you need to help their project be successful. And I think that's pretty critical at this point too.
Now, you really have to be in on the ground floor to be effective in your role as a special unit and utility support.
Yeah, good point. So as we move forward into scoping these items in the programming stage here, we want to look at certain things, including determining project limits. As you might be aware, project limits are very important in identifying scope and what's involved in a project. As far as, is this an overlay or a reconstruction or new construction? Very important within the project limits to understand the early scope of work and how it might pertain to the subsurface utility condition, the existing condition. For example, is there a new storm sewer system or drainage upgrades planned for this project within the project limits? Very important to convey that to the utility coordination team. Will boring be involved? Again, that's one of those check boxes in the criteria that we must look at as well. Signals are important to identify because of the nature of the installation of a new signal. The caissons are large. The type of equipment that must install the caissons for a new signal drill quite deep and have large diameter holes that they must use to install these signals. So knowing that early on does help us identify, where the needs for SUE are, and being able to move that piece into consideration is important. Will easements be required for any electrical or telephone or new lighting? Is important to understand outside of project limits. So it may be that you need an easement to move over to an alley or outside what is perceived to be the project limits in order to tie in electrical service to a new signal or to a new facility. So those are considerations that need to be identified during this process so that they can move quicker and not hold up the project later on by coming in late with some of these things. Are there any utility upgrades that need to happen, whether it's with stakeholders, municipalities, or utility companies that have old, aged infrastructure that may need to be upgraded, and maybe a good time to look at that as a possibility as well. And then when you look at the SUE consultant selection side, there's several ways to procure SUE services. CDOT has SUE NPS contracts out there right now. There's 3 of them. Cardinal, which is now T2 Engineering, is a contract we have in place for statewide support. Also, KCI Technologies is a company that's under SUE NPS, and Surveying and Mapping, or SAM, is also available under NPS for anybody needing SUE services on a project. Also, project-specific selection can be obtained for any SUE consultant, really, that fits the scope of work, that has the ability to complete the scope of work and has the technology and the background to meet the ASC 38 standards, and has a utility engineer on board that can stamp and certify SUE plans. So there is some criteria on the SUE component that is in a master scope of work that we do have available for inclusion into a project-specific selection in the D phase. So if you have a need to add the SUE into just a project-specific scope, make sure you're talking to the region utility program managers about this SUE scope of work that should be included, so that you have everything you need when it comes to consultant selection during the solicitation process.
So one of the things I looked at here, and that we've come across recently, and it's really also important to understand ownership of the area surrounding the project. Are we going to be widening the right-of-way? Is the ownership adjacent to our right-of-way private, or is it public, or, for instance, federally owned land? Do we own the right-of-way outright, or are we there under highway easement deed? And those can actually impact project cost and help determine that initial scope of your project. So looking at land ownership throughout the project is another key element here.
Yeah, a very good point when it comes to scope and budget all tied together in this module. The final bullet up there is the SUE consultant under a general engineering NPS, which we do have several general engineering contracts out there that have SUE built into their scope of work, and have certain vendors that are available under the general engineering NPS. So if there is opportunity, or you're pursuing a general NPS for design support, and you need SUE, make sure you look at that NPS and make sure the SUE component or the SUE scope is in there and available under that. And again, refer back to your region utility program managers for support on identifying whether or not you're going with the correct NPS, and have SUE available in there. They can help you with that, and also engineering contracts can help with identification of SUE services within those general engineering MPS contracts. Also available to everyone is a couple handouts. Module 2, Handout 1, CDOT's Master SUE Scope of Work. Again, that's shown on the upper right of the slide and available as a handout in the reference document, so that you can look at that and see what the scope of work is for services if you're trying to include that. And then also we have Module 2, Handout 2. It's a CDOT SUE request form, and this is extremely helpful in identifying your project limits, the SUE specific components of that, and it helps with solicitation of proposals from the SUE vendors. And so you can send that off to multiple vendors if you're looking to try and get a best price, best schedule from a vendor. This is a good sheet that lets them know what they need to propose on. And so again, those are 2 handouts that are available for everyone. So again, moving through programming still and looking at SUE notification and utility timeline. First task is Colorado 811 or the One Call Center and submitting a SUE notification. The SUE notification required by the state statute, as identified earlier, requires the engineer of record or engineer in charge of the project to call 811 to let them know they have a SUE required project. The request is for quality level D utility providers information, their records, their best available records that they can provide to us. We prefer paper copies. They do have the option to mark the utilities in the field, but the goal is to provide the quality level D information to a SUE provider, and then allows them to move forward with the SUE investigation and build a quality level D map for site use, and then again to move forward with a SUE required project. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a little bit. Utility clearance level timelines. Again, these are just high level at this point. If you're a project manager, trying to identify, what the schedule would be to get to add at this point for a minor utility involved project, low to medium risk. Again, that's earlier we spoke about low being a chip seal, resurfacing to medium risk, signal project of that nature. It would typically be a 4 to 6 month process to get to clearance from this stage, programming, scoping to add. So, and then major utility involvement, medium to high risk. So again, a signal project to a major reconstruction of a highway, storm sewer replacement, and all that good stuff. We're looking at more 8 to 18 month process for utilities and SUE and every coordination in SUE to achieve add date. So again, high level, it becomes more refined as you move forward in the process from here, but this is again just to try and give a benchmark. And then we talk about railroad because most people either know or don't know that the railroad clearance is also included under the utility clearance. And so if you have a railroad component in your project, then it will fall under the same umbrella of utility clearance. But again, railroad involvement could be maintenance, on the low side, just a maintenance consent type thing, or to a medium project where maybe it's widening a crossing or adding a sidewalk, and then to a major project where you're building a new bridge for the railroad across your interstate, and it's required to build that bridge before you can do other phases. And so those are the timelines. So low to medium, 4 to 6 months, and then a major is anywhere from a year and a half to 2 years to try and get a railroad project out. So just keep that in mind. We're not going to focus on railroad in this training, but we will have more training on railroad specific later on. But just keep in mind that railroad is part of the utility process management when it comes to that. Joe, did I miss anything?
Well, there's a couple things here to add. One, that initial call to, as part of your required SUE notification, is communicating with 811. The second bullet point, requesting QLD data, is really where you begin your in-person, one-on-one type communication with the providers that are in the area and requesting that data collection. 811 somewhat does that for you, but we found it much more useful if you can use your local contacts to reach out to and try to get that data from them directly. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, as your supervisor is going to go out into the field, he's going to really need your project survey control diagram. So you want to make sure that you communicate with your survey department to get that information over your supervisor, so that when they go and collect the data, the QLD data, they can tie that into the CDOT project. So just 2 points that we wanted to add here.
Okay, no, those are good. And again, we're emphasizing the bottom of the slide that this is a utility coordination effort. That again, the utility coordination staff involved in this project would be working on this and coordinating this with the group. Also part of the new world of CDOT non-track and project development plans is this design process flowchart that will be in the on-track system to try to track where we're at in the process for utilities. So there is a path there that starts with utilities. It's hard to see on this, but this is a handout that is part of Module 2, handout number 3, and it's labeled the on-track utility railroad clearance process. So please review this, because it does have a track for utilities and it also has one for railroad, because the two, even though they're cleared under one utility clearance, they do they have a tendency to track at different paces or different speeds. So the railroad project may take longer or may take less time than a utility project. So it's just keep that in mind, and how the two run parallel, but they do have to end up at the end. They do have to fall at the same, finish at the same point in time. And so this is just, again, to emphasize how the two work and how we get from start to clearance through scoping, preliminary design, and final design up at the top. It's how they have it broken out. But just again, part of the process and how we're tracking at this stage and getting started and moving forward from here.
And that's specifically for design bid build, right?
This is correct. Yeah. So this is design bid build only. I don't know if there's opportunity. I'm sure there is at some point to have a design build and CMGC track as well. But this example is for design bid build. Good point, Joe. Again, programming, scoping, and other considerations to keep in mind at this stage. We're looking at governmental, quasi-governmental, adjoining landowners that have utilities that may be affected by a project. So when the utility in question is owned by governmental or quasi-governmental, quasi could be a go ahead.
A district, or,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, a development district, or there's other quasi-governmental statutes that define what a quasi-governmental agency is. Most sewer districts and that are included, so they would be eligible for costs, relocation costs that CDOT would be on the hook for, and then consider how to design and estimate where to relocate. Those considerations are definitely important, because depending on how our design unfolds, it could increase the cost of these relocations substantially. And so we want to make sure that it's known that there are these entities within a project and convey that from the utility coordination side to the project design team and everybody else involved. And then consideration for when to relocate needs to be, one of those, is it pre-construction or during construction? That's always a balance of when we should be looking at these relocations. But that really kind of comes to better determination as we move through the design process into 30–60% design. Then we should know, exactly when those things will be moving forward. Private utility considerations include, are there any easements that CDOT will overtake? That's important because a private utility within an easement is eligible for relocation costs to be reimbursed, and also replacement easements for them to move if they so choose. They can then move from their old easement to a new easement, and the time and the cost to do that is very important to consider. But we can also, work with them on other ways to accommodate them within our right-of-way as well, if they're amenable to that. So irrigation impacts are also extremely important because irrigation is a facility that CDOT typically pays for. We're responsible to keep connection of irrigation water flowing through our highway systems, and so we typically own and maintain those structures. And when it comes to relocation, we have to definitely coordinate with the irrigation companies on impacts to their facilities, and any changes in size and type of pipes is definitely something we have to coordinate with them as well. And then when we move to the railroad, any railroad impacts can be costly for relocations, any adjustments, and then, of course, flagging, protection while our contractors are out on site, or surveyors, or anything that requires work within close proximity to the railroad tracks needs to be considered cost impacts as well for design and construction. So,
and these are really good, I think, a good due diligence slide, because it can have such significant impacts on design phase, and its cost and schedule. Are you designing a water line, as well as figuring out how to construct it with your own contractor? Is it going to impact your construction phasing? Is it such a significant number of utilities to be relocated within the site that you actually have to schedule a utility relocation phase prior to road construction? So these steps are important.
Yeah, I agree. And they're definitely required to identify and ask these questions, because at this point, we're moving past that. Now we need to try and put a dollar amount to these, a high-level dollar amount to those considerations. And so this is where we move now into the budget considerations for those items, and considering the need for project-level budgets for in-house labor, outside agency labor for reviews, including utility project design cost estimates. There's tools that we have in place for that, and we'll show an example here in a minute, but there's a reference cost calculator, CDOT's cost estimating tools, and then identifying those high-level potential costs, relocation costs that we talked about in the previous slide, the considerations that lead into that. Again, those railroad costs for preliminary engineering reviews, D-phase stuff, relocation or railroad equipment, relocation costs that we pay for under the C phase, or even a utility phase in some cases, and flagging that is involved. That can be an extremely costly number when it comes to flagging support during a construction phase. It can really impact those budgets. So that's why we emphasize it here. Then we get into possible purchase of easements for electrical services or replacement easements. That's what we were talking about. So we need to try and work with right-of-way on some of those things, and maybe it's even a high-level dollar amount to try an area plus a unit value that's available to try and put a budget together for that. And then, you know, a big one is SUE costs and trying to figure out what those would include. So we have just, again, a range that we look at from a SUE perspective, a low cost or low risk at the low end at 0.5% of your construction budget to a bigger project that may be 1.5% of the construction budget. You know, so if you have a $100 million project, you might want to look at it and say, oh, it's a big project. It may be 1% or $1 million for your SUE budget just right out of the gate. And so those are, and it may be a little higher depending on the project and some of the historical data that we found on smaller projects, signal projects, you know, whatever it might be. So it's, the key is these budget considerations and these percentages that the region utility program manager has in their back pocket can help, you know, can help the design staff or the project manager identify these early on. And then considering later on during construction management, it's important that utility inspection costs be considered in your project, whether it's going to be staffed with in-house project engineers, or is it going to be consultant based, or, you know, or what? And then considering utility surveying for utility as-built, that could be also a consideration at this point, wondering, you know, whether or not it's going to be one of the CM staff from above, or is it going to be construction surveyor identified to maybe a 625 spec, you know, change in our survey requirements to have the construction surveying team do the as-built. So anyway, just asking those questions now helps move or earmark the budget for later activities that are definitely necessary for utilities.
Yeah, and this next slide is kind of it's kind of almost a multi-tool of an estimating spreadsheet that we put together, and it can be used in a number of different ways. And I think of two specifically. One, it can be used just to look at labor cost of in-house labor, what we think our time is going to be if it's a high-risk utility situation, what our role would be. It could be used how many man hours we have dedicated to that project in any number of categories. Or it could be used if you've got utility data and you know that the project scope maybe more readily than other projects, and we can estimate relocation cost or what impacts you're going to have to existing facilities. Are they going to be impacts to public facilities? And are those costs going to be CDOT costs? So you can begin to use those, you know, factors of what you know about the project and plug that data into here. Are we installing storm drain? Is it going to impact pressurized systems like water? Is it going to impact gas lines, which are not our responsibility unless they're in easements? Or what are the other, you know, what are those costs going to be associated with it? So we've created this kind of really multi-tool or flexible calculator that helps us kind of determine very, very high level, large round number cost initially to kind of put those in the budget and kind of earmark a spot for utility specific cost very early on. And then as we learn more about the project, we kind of tweak those numbers and get a better idea. But it's good to get, I like to say, get the utility foot in the door here on cost and give your project manager an idea of some of those costs going forward.
Yeah, no, this is a great tool, and for those attending the training today, just make sure to refer to the reference documents. This is Module 2, handout number 4, Utility Design Cost Estimate. So it is available to look at as a handout and take a little more detailed look at this tool for use. And again, a lot of times this will come from utility coordination team, and working, side by side with the project managers and the resident engineering staff on development, so that the shared information between the groups, and everybody has a pretty good high level, like you said, of the round numbers moving forward with the project. So yeah.
When I fill this form out, I'll usually make notes off to the side as well. As you can see, we can put in things like, historic cost of SUE and an intersection, $75,000 or something like that, and note where you get your numbers from. So, like I said, it's very flexible, and it can give you a good overview of anticipated cost.
Yeah. So other budget considerations when it comes to relocation costs to consider. Again, the CDOT estimate, FHWA requires an independent cost estimate to verify the utility owner's estimate, and that it's it's a reasonable cost is required. And so, that's what we're working on high level here. And as we move forward, we refine that, and then it gets included later on in the process, in utility process, as far as a contract goes. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on in our modules. But from here, we're starting with a high level cost estimate and then refining it as we go. Preliminary engineering design phase. This is definitely, if we have a railroad scope of work that includes design level reviews from the railroad. They do require preliminary engineering contracts, and so there is a design phase budget request that does need to happen early so that we can start this process. And then again, relocation of railroad equipment or other types of railroad work during construction phase activities will need to be included. But we have an example here of flagging. I don't think we emphasize the cost associated with it, but this is why we keep adding flagging into budget considerations. We had our Grand Avenue Bridge project in Glenwood Springs a few years back. Flagging is at $1,500 a day. So yeah, we had about a $1.4 million budget in our back pocket for flagging. So it gets quite expensive on a budget level request. So just keep that in mind when you look at flagging days. And then electric and or telephone service requirements, including ITS, new electrical services for our traffic signals, our beacons, any signs or VMS boards out there. We may have to bring electric service from a long ways away. That could cost, to bring that service in. For cameras, closed circuit cameras that are on as part of co-trip, those cameras support the ITS program, and we do coordinate with trying to supply electrical services to all these things. And so just keep that in mind. It may be that the facilities within the project limits, but just also keep in mind where the power feeds to make those things work come from. So again, this is a utility coordination effort at this stage to communicate this, coordinate it, convey it back and forth between utility owners and project level design staff and the utility program managers as well. And then budget considerations for SUE, getting a little more detail here. Costs to provide SUE for quality level B and A. Again, we emphasized per ASC 38. This is a published range. That's why we use it. It's a national average of 1% to 1.5% of the total construction cost on average. Could be higher, could be lower. The small rural projects, a few utilities cost less. Seems to make sense. And then large urban projects with significant utilities certainly cost more. So CDOT's Region 3 experience. Joe, you probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, and it's kind of self-explanatory. I mean, for larger projects, they really come within that 0.5% to 1.5% total construction budget, but it certainly is less of a useful tool when you get to a smaller project or a rural project or an intersection. For example, the 3 projects that we looked at or analyzed with intersection signal improvements, the cost was substantial when you considered it as a proportion of your construction budget. So, you know, we've got examples that you can use, and certainly regions can talk to other regions and see what their estimates are. But when you get to smaller projects, these estimates are not as accurate as we'd like them to be, and we've got historic data to provide there. You know, and make sure, you know, there's a note in here that says, does your capital improvement budget anticipate this cost increase? Really, does your project budget include that? I think that's probably a holdover from talking to municipalities and counties about their budgets. But does your project budget include these costs? And that's an important point to make here.
I think that's a good point, Joe. I mean, the local agencies are definitely part of our program in some cases, you know. So certainly, if you have a local agency project, make sure that they understand some of our experiences as they approach trying to deliver a federal aid project under the local agency program. So if you're a local agency coordinator in this training, make sure you're talking to your local agency partners about these SUE costs and what that means. But you know, also you could let them know the potential SUE savings on top of all that. You know, we do see information coming out, and we're still early in our process, but when you look at the national data, typical construction projects published, you know, that use quality level A and quality level B data may cost, you know, the cost overall will be 10 to 15% less than a project that only uses C and D, and that's attributed to many factors, but a lot of it's attributed to the higher quality, higher confidence you have with spending the money to take it to quality level B and quality level A. It's reflected later in less delayed. The higher confidence allows you to find utilities quicker and move quicker, and production rates on construction side of things, less damages and things like that because of the certainty, a higher quality of the certainty of the data. So that's what that bullet point's trying to articulate during construction, that the better information, the more of the cost savings you see from it. There's also information published by, for example, University of Toronto. This study, the bulk of the cost savings came in the following areas: contractor claims, less contractor claims, which is, you know, is certainly attractive to a project when it comes to construction. Reduction in utility relocation costs, because you spend the time looking at the data early, good SUE information, which allows designers to maybe make some adjustments on their side, mitigate some of the long relocation projects and more evasive type of projects that cost us time and money that we're on the hook for, and then all other costs. You know, there's all the miscellaneous costs that come from this research. But overall, the message is that using SUE will reduce your risk to claims and relocation costs overall. So it's definitely important, not only to do it from a standpoint from the agency, but also because we're mandated by law to do it as well. So anyway, scope of work and the estimate can be modified if needed, and the scope of work will obviously drive the final cost of your SUE percentage. So over on the left-hand side, really, you know, keep the scope of work specific and to your needs, so that we're not overspending, but make sure it has enough to cover what you need for your project as well.
Yeah, and I think the significance of the cost can't be understated here. If you have a $30 million project, then you've got to, you take the average of a 1% of your total construction budget being dedicated to just the SUE investigation. You're talking about a $300,000 line item there, which if you don't have budget, you have to go out and find in your design phase. It could be a bit of a shock to the system. So you really want to make sure that you're looking at this and at least throwing some number at it based on input from your utility engineering program manager to get you a number to put into your budget, your design budget initially. So consultant budget.
Yep, very good. If anybody's wondering, the trains keep coming by. That's because Joe and I have hired them for this segment, just so people know. Construction management is also a budget consideration that we want to emphasize at this point. Again, just to make sure there's placeholders for construction management, utility inspection costs, whether it's going to be done by in-house or CDOT supported staff or by consultant staff that has this, the ability to inspect the utilities during early relocations, and then also, again, surveying, whether it's independent or whether it ties to the project C phase, has the ability to survey the as constructed locations and develop as-built plans for the agency. So this concludes the planning phase, module 2, the CDOT utilities process management training. The next module in the course will examine the 0 to 30% design phase. And some of the key points that we'd like you to remember moving through this module is the number and extent of the utilities that have an impact on schedule and cost, and the type of construction, and how much of the impact the utilities may have on that type of construction, whether it's design bid build or design build. We didn't get into a whole lot of that, but just in the type of relocation, and just using some of the cost estimating tools that we have to consider high, medium, and low risk scenarios, and for SUE and for utilities. So again, and just early and often communication with utility owners is key, and just emphasizing how much utility coordination is happening in the planning phase, and how much information gathering is going on, because once we move into our design 0 to 30%, all of this planning has to be in place, all the contracting has to be ready to go, because of how we take off from design, 0% design to 30% design is gonna start happening, and things are gonna start moving rather quickly. So thank you again. We'll conclude module number 2.